Hello, I'm Sarah Butcher and this is Tales of the Extraordinary, a brand new podcast that pulls back the curtain on the people that work in the energy industry. This 4-part mini-series will focus on what it's like to be a woman working in this sector. Across each episode, I'll be speaking to some amazing women as they share their origin stories around why they chose energy and what has shaped them personally and professionally so far. This first episode also coincides with International Women's Day, where the theme this year is Embrace Equity. What a brilliant springboard to start the new series from. I'm very excited to introduce my first guest, Natasha Howlett, who I have had the privilege of knowing for a very long time now, having met her before we became grown-ups on a summer placement when we were both studying at the University of Aberdeen. Tash is the climate and emissions manager at Xodus and is passionate about decarbonising the energy industry, working with her team across the globe to really make a difference. Alongside being one of Xodus's prestigious experts, Tash is also a qualified baby yoga teacher, a champion for change for working mums, and has ambitions to try 12 new things by the end of 2023. Having said all this, she is a self-proclaimed procrastinator, which I really can't believe. So with no further ado, let's get into it. Hello, Tash, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. As this is a podcast about people in the energy industry, let's dive right in and ask the question, why energy?
Well, it's a funny question because actually I didn't choose energy, so it was never my game plan to get into this industry, really. I actually kind of saw myself off mapping the seabed as some kind of hydrographic surveyor or counting sharks in some far-flung corner of the world. So it was kind of accidental how I got into it. And it came about by a series of summer placements that I volunteered for when I was at university in my summer breaks. So while all my buddies were off counting turtles in Greece, having a whale of a time, I had my sensible head on and was thinking, let's get some relevant work experience under my belt so that my CV is kind of growing and I'm more employable by the end of my degree. One of those placements is, of course, where I met you. I had some really fun summers. I met some fantastic friends, loads of funny stories and great memories from it. But what ultimately that meant is by the end of my degree, I had these 3 environmental placements on my CV. And so naturally, when I was applying for jobs, those were the kinds of interviews that I was landing. So it was never my intention to get into kind of environmental management or oil and gas, but that's kind of how it came about, because it was just the first people that offered me a job, really. And it's just gone from there.
You were in Aberdeen, that's right.
I was in Aberdeen. But my plan was, I spent 4 years at university saying the day I graduate, I'm getting on a plane and I'm getting out of Aberdeen. And here I am 20 years later, because it's not been, it's been one of the best things that could have happened to me. Not Aberdeen necessarily, but the industry. I got into this industry and it has been very kind of serendipitous set of circumstances where I've got a job for life. I've built a successful career. It's been, stable. I've managed to move around and have some really interesting positions. So certainly not been a bad decision, really.
No, and you've done pretty well. If we go back to any of those work placements, was there any of particular note? Was there any interesting activities?
I mean, I'd say highlights, some lowlights for those times were my first placement I did was with Aberdeen and Northern Marts, which is what Sainston, basically, if you're local, that's what you'll know it as. And the mission I was given was to try and find an alternative route for the large volume of furniture products that were left over from the weekly auctions. Up until that point, they were being burned like an enormous mountain of furniture and toxic pollutants being burned. And I remember being told, the P&J want to run an article on you. And I was so excited. And I rang my grandparents and told them I'm going to be in the paper. There's a journalist coming out to take photos of me. The photo of me was of me standing in a skip of furniture with a hard hat on, and just there couldn't have been any less glamorous. And then, of course, my grandparents were saying, where's the article? You must send us a copy. So as much as I tried to hide it from everybody, that was my first foray into any kind of publicity. And then another kind of low point was my first graduate job. I worked for the city council in their kind of environmental team. And it's environmental in the very loose sense of the word, really. it was on the kind of community waste and recycling team. So we were tasked with trying to ensure that the recycling facilities were being utilised effectively. And one of those, albeit pointless tasks, was to go around the recycling points, counting the percentage of rubbish that was in the big recycling bins that you see in supermarket car parks. So I'm in Morrison's car park one day with my high vis on and my hard hat, peering into a bin going, yes, that one is 75% full. I never did find out what the council actually does with those stats. And this guy walks past me with his little girl holding her hand, and he said to her, see, that's what happens when you don't stick in at school.
Oh, God. And
I didn't last very long in that job. That was kind of the motivator to get out.
I can imagine. And then you fast forward to 2020 when like bin men are like holding up society and are key workers. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's brilliant. And so it sounds like you've got like a really good work ethic. So what were you like at school?
I was a chatterbox, so I would frequently get kind of told off, or a board eraser thing thrown at me for talking too much in the classroom. But I was a clever kid, I was a straight A kind of student. I made friends easily. I went to a lot of schools. I think that's probably quite an important formative part of who I am. I went to 14 different schools all over the place because my dad was in the military for a while, and then when he left the military, we just kind of followed wherever there was work for him. So it was fun, sometimes it was challenging. Sometimes I wasn't in a school for very long before we were kind of moving on again, but it certainly kind of taught me really good people skills and how to make friends and how to kind of dig deep and get yourself entrenched with, groups of people. And that's certainly a skill I use all day, every day in my current role.
And then, so you've been in the industry a while now, and you've definitely come into that, like you were saying, that real like sociable, you lead a team. How long have you been with Xodus now?
I've been here for just under 2.5 years, actually. So it's flown by. I joined in the October of 2020. So just after the pandemic, just after the world had gone mad, started with Xodus when I hadn't physically met anyone in Xodus. I'd had a Teams interview with the leadership team. I was also bringing part of a team with me. So it was a really interesting time to kind of join a company and, be issued a laptop and start working from home, having never met any of these colleagues. And most of those colleagues I didn't go on to meet until, well into the following year. And 2021 was when I met anybody. And I remember thinking, I went to quite a big kind of internal conference event, which I remember that was the first time I'd seen you. And it was everybody was there. And my sort of lasting memory of it was thinking, gosh, everybody's really small compared to what I thought they were going to look like on the camera. So, yeah, when you think that person's going to be tall or small, actually meeting them in person was very different to how I'd thought it would be.
Yeah, and I've had to really struggle with that filter. Sometimes, like, since lockdown, I've met people and I've gone to comment and I'm like, stop. Actually, before lockdown, you just met people and took them as they were.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've taken out of lockdown is I have come into contact with so many people at Xodus that I've gone, hi, who are you? I'm Natasha Howlett. And they say, I've met you several times, or I'm in a meeting with you on a monthly basis and have been for 2 years. And my excuse is just, I'm really sorry, you just look really different in person to how you look on screen.
And going through that period, obviously you were juggling like a new job, kids. Was there anything that you did to get through it?
Yeah. So at the time I had an 18-month-old daughter. My daughter was, she's my youngest, so she was only 18 months old, and she was very kind of needy and clingy because obviously the world had gone mad, and she'd been at home with me full time for kind of 6 months by that point after having been at nursery. So, trying to have meetings after I picked her up from nursery where she'd be climbing up on my lap and she'd be saying things like, Mummy, stop speaking to that man and speak to me, when I was speaking to my then manager. Actually, one of the tactics I developed with a very close friend of mine was when you weren't allowed to go out other than for daily exercise and you weren't allowed to meet socially and the pubs were all shut and things, I really missed social wine and seeing this particular friend, because I'd seen her most days for the last 10 years. So we developed this kind of sneaky approach of, well, why don't we go for a really big walk together? Because that's our daily exercise. So we're not breaking any rules. and why don't we fill our travel mugs with red wine? So we used to meet up halfway between where we both live with a big travel mug of red wine. And we'd do this big 8-mile loop for a couple of hours and talk the hind legs off each other. And we'd have the rest of the red bottle of red in backpacks. And that kind of then evolved onto, I started trying to do the Couch to 5K app just to try and get out the house a bit more and get some headspace. And she was such a good friend that she would meet me at the end of my run with the red wine in her backpack. So I'd have gone and done my run and felt better about myself, thinking, oh, look at me, I'm so healthy, I'm exercising, and then reward myself with red wine and a walk.
Brilliant. Exactly. It's balance. It's all about balance, isn't it? So just before we move on, I think you've really done very well. You're leading this global team now, looking at emissions and climate. But who are the people that have been your people, that have championed you, picked you up from crying on the kitchen floor? Who are the people that got you to where you are now?
Probably quite a few. I mean, first and foremost, my husband. He's always been my biggest cheerleader. He's fully supportive of everything that I do and all of the crazy risks that I have taken over the years. My mum as well is one of my cheerleaders, and my sister definitely. So they're always kind of pushing me and telling me to go for things. And I'm very lucky that I've got a really good circle of excellent friends. And some of those are, people in my team. So I've worked with some of those people through having, both of my children. And when I've been absolutely sleep deprived and struggling with, toddler tantrums or refusing food or just not knowing what day it is, those are the people that have brought me a much needed cup of coffee in the morning and kind of covered for me a bit when I'm exhausted. So yeah, I'm really lucky that I've got a really good support network like that.
Yeah, and you can't do it without them, can you?
Absolutely not. Those people are like the village that you need, really. And they're not all necessarily linked. So they're not all family and they're not all friends with each other, but they all bring something to the party.
Yeah. Is there any other hurdles that you think you came across that you potentially your male counterparts wouldn't have come across?
Yeah, a really good example that springs to mind is when I went back to work after having my son. I knew quite quickly that wasn't the job that I wanted anymore, because it just, my priorities had changed, and they weren't being particularly accommodating around, flexibility with him and things like that. He was 4.5 months old. He was teeny tiny. And I was approached by another company who was actually a client of mine at the time, approached me and said, look, we think we could create a position for you. Would you be interested? So I set up this job interview, just a telephone interview. And it was kind of an informal chat because I'd met Mike loads of times over the years. But I was also an expressing mother. So there was no provision of a room in the office that I worked in to go and sit in and express. And as any new mum would know, it's kind of every couple of hours. So I was told you can go and sit in the stationery cupboard if you want, but there was no lock on the door. And that made me feel really uncomfortable. So I used to go and sit in my car every few hours and express. And it was January, so it was absolutely freezing. So I had this telephone interview. I was trying to double up, right? I've got to go and express, but I've also got this telephone interview and I can't be outside the building for so long to do both. I'm just going to have to do them at the same time. So I'm sat with this really noisy pump going, which I didn't think was that noisy, but I'm doing this telephone interview and kind of 20 minutes in, the guy says to me, it's very noisy where you are. Is everything okay? Because what he could hear was, So I have to say, think on my feet, I was just said, oh, it's actually the air conditioning in the meeting room that I'm sitting in is broken, so it's really noisy. Just hang on a second and I'll see if I can turn it off. So that's a really good example of, when I look back on that now, I think that was absolutely insane that I was having to do that. But it didn't seem insane to me at the time. It just felt like, I should just be grateful I've got a job and I'm the inconvenience because I'm the one that's here and I need access to this room or a stationery cupboard. So that's one good example. But equally, there's been loads of positive examples. Like I worked offshore as a woman offshore for a while, and people couldn't have been any more accommodating and nice and, welcoming to me. And I never felt intimidated or that it was a place I didn't belong.
No, absolutely. I when I've been offshore, I've felt like an absolute princess. I've been, shown around, put to the front of the queue. It's just been brilliant. So, But no, that story is absolutely bonkers. What a brilliant story,
Yeah, it depends who you tell that story to. You tell that story to some people, some men especially, and they kind of get really uncomfortable at the thought of it and kind of screw their face up. But yeah, it's part of my story. So tell my son that when he's older.
If you don't laugh, you'll cry.
Exactly.
So the next thing I'd like to talk about is what has been your biggest challenge?
Probably trying to establish myself professionally or come back professionally after having my kids. So the two most challenging points in my career really have been, I've come back to work after very short periods of time off with both of my kids. So with my son, I only took 4 months off because I was a self-employed contractor. And trying to explain to people that, you know, I've had a baby, not a lobotomy, I can come back and do the same job I was doing before. That's been quite challenging and actually has ultimately resulted in me leaving both of those jobs because of frustrations with how I've been treated when I've come back. But saying that, all of that's resulted in quite positive moves. So I've left both of those jobs, and every time I've moved on, it's been for a better position with a better company.
And how is it, I suppose, being pregnant, like as a contractor who has to go offshore? How is that for you?
It's been tricky both times, again, because I was self-employed both times I was pregnant. The first time I wasn't long into my new position, and it was a job that I really loved, and it had so much potential where I could genuinely make a big difference. So I kept it secret for a very long time that I was pregnant with my son. I didn't tell work until I was kind of 6 months pregnant, until it was the very last day legally I had to tell them, basically. But as a result of that, I had to do all of the duties that were required of me, assuming I was a non-pregnant person. And that involved going offshore. So there was a trip offshore with a regulator where I almost miscarried my son because I was just doing too much, climbing too many stairs on the platform that I was on, and had to get medevaced off. So that was a pretty scary time. My older self would tell myself that was a really silly thing to have done and, you know, put myself at risk. But it was just the pressure I felt at the time. And I felt like I'm so new in the door. If I tell my employer that I'm pregnant, there's every chance they're just going to terminate my contract. And then who's going to employ a pregnant person knowing that I'm, you know, about to have a baby in the next 6 to 9 months?
And that's such a burden to carry. Do you think as an industry we've moved on? Because how old is your son now?
He's 9 now. So I think there's been huge progress in the last 10 years. Absolutely. I still think those issues do exist within certain companies, and I'm sure they do within other industries. But I think we in this industry have moved on leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. Certainly the number of professional women that I work with compared to the number of professional women I worked with 10 years ago is significantly higher. I don't feel like the minority now like I did 10 years ago. So hopefully that has changed. And it's certainly something that I champion. So nobody under my watch will ever suffer with that from being pregnant or coming back to work with a young child.
Absolutely. And as well as pregnancy at work, are there any other taboo subjects that you don't think that we're tackling or that we could be better at in the energy industry?
I think a lot of the kind of misogynistic, ageist, sexist issues that were rife 10 years ago have mostly disappeared, although I do still experience them occasionally, but I'm much more confident about stamping them out now because it's not acceptable. So 10 years ago, I wouldn't have felt confident. There was this issue around, I think, just be grateful that I've got a job and that, you know, I'm doing this and I need the money. And some of that's just to do with youth and inexperience as well, not necessarily anybody else's fault. But I do think there's still issues there that need to be tackled. I think there's a major issue around working parents and not enough support for them. I'm a big advocate of, you know, flex appeal and flexible working and supporting working parents, reducing, you know, the working hours in a week, all those kinds of things. I think those are the things that tip the balance and make a company the great place to work when you are a parent.
And where do you think Xodus sits on that flexi working piece?
I think they're certainly one of the more progressive companies that I've worked for in recent years. And it's certainly one of the reasons I love working here is because I was very open in my interview and said, you know, I've got young children and I don't want to apologise for the fact I have to do school runs and school pickups. And occasionally they're going to be sick and things like that. And I've had nothing but support for all of those things as and when I've needed them. So I think it's definitely one of the more progressive companies. And I think we've made big leaps in terms of progress with things like our maternity policy, our flexible working policy, and allowing part-time workers to also be project managers now. So yeah, I do think it's a great place to be.
And is there anywhere we should be looking to that is doing it right? Any country or industry that you think that we should be taking inspiration from?
I think the Scandi countries, or places like Sweden and Denmark, I think they're really leading the way with their work-life balance and their provision of quality childcare. I read quite a lot about the World Happiness surveys and why Swedish children grow up generally more content. And I find it really fascinating. What are they doing that is so different to what we're doing in the UK, so different from Anglo-American parenting? And a lot of it is just to do with this positive mental attitude that they're raised around. Their parents aren't stressed. They're not working to the bone. They're not rushing from one thing to the next. They're present. They're mindful. Their time off is their time together as a family. But I think we cannot achieve that without providing better quality, more affordable childcare in the UK. We have the most expensive childcare in the world. And I just don't think that's right. So I think that's something that the government really needs to focus on and tackle. Save the Children estimate that there's almost 900,000 mums stuck at home who would like to be out working, but they can't afford the childcare, so they can't justify going back to work. Imagine when we're saying that there's a skills shortage and a labour gap in the market in the UK, and yet we can't import those skills and labour from other parts of the world as easily now since Brexit. Imagine you got those 900,000 women back to work and they're earning even a mean average salary. That would raise in the region of something like £7.5 billion in PAYE and national insurance for the economy. So if you fix the problem, look at what the potential benefit is.
Yeah, and it could make such a difference, and definitely would then mean there were more women in the workforce doing meaningful jobs that they want to be doing.
Exactly. You can't close the gender pay gap completely until we fix that problem.
Definitely. I think that's definitely food for thought, Tash. So thank you. We'll leave your biggest challenge there and move on to your biggest success. What would you say is your biggest success from your lifetime?
My biggest success is my marriage. I'm really proud of my marriage. I've been married for 15 years this summer, really happily married, and we've created this lovely life with 2 children and just really happy family life. I'm really proud of having done that because I've watched a lot of my peers and a lot of other people around me who haven't made it that far with their marriage, or they're on marriage number 2 or 3. And so I'm really proud of the fact that we've created, a stable home for our kids and a happy environment to bring them up in.
And if you go forward, so in 25 years' time, and you've got your kids back round the table and you're having your dinner, and what is the one thing that you would like to see in them? What would success look like if you saw that in them?
I think contentment is a really big thing. So that's something that I struggle with because we moved around so much when I was growing up. I always have itchy feet and, want to know what's coming up next, or where we could go and live, or what the next job role is for me. And in some ways, that's a really positive thing because it's what drives me and motivates me and makes me ambitious and hungry for all these things. I'd like to make sure that my children aren't quite, they're more kind of settled, so more grounded with where they are. But I think ultimately, if I could sit around the dinner table, or I could be in a room in 25 years and hear one of my children say to one of their friends, I want to have a marriage like my mum and dad have. And, I want to be like my mum or my dad, then that is the goal for me. That is ultimate kind of pat on the back. We've done such a good job that they're not trying to not be like us, and we haven't damaged them.
Oh, brilliant. No, I think that's such a nice feeling, like I've done a good job, you know?
Exactly. And it's such a simple thing, but actually it's really hard to achieve that. As a parent, you're every day thinking, oh, have I just kind of, caused some long-standing issue because have I just said the wrong thing, or did I raise my voice too much, or, are there not enough rules, are there too many rules? So actually, if we can get to the end of it all and they're happy, healthy, rounded individuals, then happy days.
Yeah, I mean, if we had more contented and kind people in the world, what a better place we would live in.
Absolutely. And, I always say, when people say to me, what would you say to somebody starting out in the industry nowadays? Or what would you say to, or not even in this industry, what's a really important life skill? I think just be nice and be kind, because it is such a simple thing to do. It's free. It doesn't matter what background you've come from. It doesn't matter whether you have a university education or not. Everybody has the ability to be nice and be kind and pay it forward. And that's something that is really important to me. And I try and instill that in my kids. You don't get involved in bullying. And if you see somebody being bullied, go and intervene and see if you can help, and check that they're okay if they've hurt themselves. And, if we pull up on a garage forecourt and I go in to pay for my fuel and there's a couple of paramedics filling up, I always make a point of saying to the cashier, can I buy them both a cup of the Starbucks coffee that is on the stand? And I always tell my kids when I get back in the car, we've just bought those paramedics a cup of coffee each, because they're doing a really hard job and they're not earning a huge amount of money, and they're doing that to help people. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's so nice to hear. And do you think that's in you, or do you think you've been influenced as you were growing up?
I mean, I must have been influenced, because I didn't grow up in a cruel family. So I guess one of the people that I would say is just, one of the kindest people from my childhood was my paternal grandfather. So he was a Polish refugee in the Second World War. His father was a Polish policeman, and he was kind of executed by the Nazis one day. Just came and collected him from the house and left my grandfather with his two sisters and their mum. So my granddad was just a small child, probably a similar age to my son now. He was kind of 9 or 10. And the way they started evacuating children from Poland in the war was to evacuate the orphans first. So his mother took him down to the train station one day to say goodbye to some of his classmates that had been orphaned, and put them on this train. And one of the little girl's aunts wouldn't let her get on the train. She was just too distraught. So in a split second, my grandfather's mother pushed him on the train in her place, and he never saw her again. So no warning, no belongings, nothing. He spent 4 years traveling through Europe and Kazakhstan and all these crazy places with this convoy of orphans, and ultimately ended up in Darlington, of all places, which is where he met my grandma. But, through all that hardship, and he eventually made contact with his mother again in the 80s. My mum tells the story of being there when they first spoke to each other on the phone, but he never got a chance to see her and meet her in person before she died. But he was just so kind and so lovely, like genuinely one of the nicest human beings I've ever come across. And I see a lot of my husband, a lot of the qualities, which is strange because I didn't actively go out trying to find someone like my grandfather, but he's so similar. Even the way he hoards things in his garage, the way my granddad did, there's always a use for something. So yeah, there's probably quite a lot of influence came from him.
Oh, that's such a nice story. And then ending up in Darlington. So you would have had a Polish surname growing up.
I did. I had a Polish maiden name, and I loved it. It was kind of exotic and cool and a good talking point, and there was always a good story behind it. But I had a really strange experience when I got my my first kind of proper graduate job in oil and gas. So after the council job that I talked about earlier, I got this job, and months into it, my then manager was sitting having a coffee with me, and he just kind of flippantly said, I almost didn't interview you. And I said, why is that? He said, because you had a Polish surname, and I just kind of assumed that you wouldn't be able to speak proper English. And it was the first time ever that I'd experienced any kind of biased opinion on it, negative. And from that point onwards, I was actually getting married that year. So from that point onwards, I just started to think, gosh, if that's how people are starting to think, then maybe I'm quite excited about dropping my maiden name and having a British surname.
But do you think that is really how people think now?
Absolutely not now, because there's so many more Poles and Hungarians and, all the different nationalities that are in the UK now and supporting the job market and doing all these wonderful things. So I think now I would just blend in and not be noticed. But back then, I've never met anybody else with a Polish surname ever. But I'm proud of that heritage, though. It's a nice story to be able to tell and pass on to my kids and things. I wrote an essay on it when I was at school as part of my GCSE English, and I've still got the essay somewhere in the loft about my granddad's story and, all the details of it.
Yeah, no, I think I love the roots. Like my grandfather, he was in Vienna, and we were Jews, like the Bremner side of the family were
Wow.
Jews, and he was actually killed in one of the concentration camps. So, but it definitely is that heritage of interesting to see where you've come from to then be able to be better going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So one last and final question for you, Tash. If you could go back in time, what is the one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
I would tell her to enjoy her kind of late teens and early 20s lots more and stop being so focused on building a professional career and working all the time. So one of my only regrets is that I didn't just go backpacking for a year, for example, before I went to university. I don't regret not doing it after university, because actually I watched my friends do that and some of them really struggled to get a foot on the ladder in terms of careers. And also I'd met Carl in my third year of university, and wild horses wouldn't have dragged me away from him. So, but I do wish before I'd gone to university, in the gap between school and joining, that I'd just gone and done something wild and a bit kind of more adventurous, really. That's the one thing I would say to myself.
So has that, I said in the intro that you are looking to do 12 new things this year. Has this been the motivator for it?
No, it was I actually read a post from one of a local artist that I follow, and she'd met this lady who'd said she was going to try, I think it was 10 new crafts over the year, and she ended up saying this to friends, and then friends had mentioned it to other people, and before they knew it, they had this little craft group and a new crowd of friends, and they were able to go and book their own independent craft classes because there was enough of them. And I thought, that's such a good idea, rather than your New Year's resolution being, I'm going to be fitter or healthier or drink less, which never works for me. I thought, I'm going to go and do something positive, and I'm going to learn 12 new things, not necessarily crafty things, because I didn't want to just be doing things for the sake of it. But my first thing was actually an art class that I did last weekend. So I went to a lino printing class with a friend, which I just loved. That's one of the things I really enjoy doing in my downtime, is kind of arts and crafts and baking and things. Next up is I've signed up for advanced adult swimming lessons, because although I can swim and scuba dive, it suddenly dawned on me that if I was being chased by a great white shark, I wouldn't be able to swim very fast, because I've never been taught to front crawl. And actually, I wouldn't be chased by a great white shark. I wrote my dissertation on that. That's nonsense, and that never happens. But you get my vibe.
I was going to... Brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, maybe a better example is, if one of my kids fell off a boat in the distance, I wouldn't be able to get there very fast, breaststroking leisurely to them. So, yeah, next
I'm
up
just imagining you racing a great white shark.
So yeah, that's next up on the list. I've also bought a skipping rope, which everybody I've told about so far has kind of rolled their eyes at me when I've explained this, but I found this lady on Instagram a few weeks ago who in lockdown couldn't skip at all, which is probably
I became addicted to these videos.
Yes.
They are just absolutely, and it's incredible. It's so hard as well.
Yeah, and so she's now doing these kind of fully choreographed Beyonce dance routines with a skipping rope, and I'm like, I can do that. Definitely 5 minutes a day, I'll figure that out. I'm not so confident that's going to be one of the ones I actually succeed in, but yeah, my 12 new things, that's what I'm doing this year.
Oh, that is amazing. Well, if you need a friend for any of them, give me a shout, because I will definitely be up for doing new things. Tash, thank you so much for being so open and inspiring. You've just given us some brilliant stories with your challenges and your successes. I just love what you hope for your kids. Contentment and kindness, just absolutely inspiring.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was a pleasure as always.
Well, that concludes our first episode of Tales of the Extraordinary. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. Tune in next week when we'll be speaking to another amazing woman. Until next time, take care.
Tales of the Extraordinary is brought to you by the Xodus Empowering the Energy Industry team and produced by the Big Partnership.